for our grand reopening last Saturday. You're probably feeling good about having a little breathing room this time. That was really special. So thank you for all being a part of it. And some of you even have work on the walls. So we are very grateful to have our community here. My name is Sarah Danziger. For all of you who don't know me, I'm the education program manager here. And you are here to inaugurate our first Meet the Artist at 25 Dederick Street. So thank you for making this a nice packed house. I hope you appreciate the new chairs. No more folding chairs for those long talks. I have a couple announcements to make before we get started. We just announced, we still got a couple things to button up upstairs. So we haven't opened up the digital media lab, but stay tuned. That will be open probably in the next 2-3 weeks. And then at the end of February, we start our late winter, early spring classes. So if you haven't seen, we've got a few crit groups with Kiana Mestrich and Charles Purvis and Leslie Deschler-Canasi. Those are selling out. So if you want to be part of a weekly or monthly dialogue around your work and others, that's a really great opportunity. It's going to meet upstairs. It's going to be very nice. There's also crash course in digital photography with Jim Lafferty. That's going to be once a month to, for those who are just getting involved in digital photography or interested in it, or those of you who've, like myself, who've been busy and distracted and forgot how to use certain things on their lights and cameras. This is a great refresher. And we'll be back with Adriana Photo Book 2. We'll be playing around with our new digital press. If none of you have seen the beautiful new publication published by CBW in connection with 1080 Press for Keisha Scarville's exhibition, we made that in-house. So that's a big milestone for us. I don't know that CBW has ever published anything in-house, so stay tuned, and you'll be able to play around with that printer in Adriana's class. We also have a couple spots left in our digital media lab classes, learning Photoshop and inkjet printing. So if you don't all know Alicia Schurmeister, you're in for a treat. They are doing amazing work in the digital media lab. So if you have any questions, I also have some cards that'll get you directly there. But if you have any questions, a couple of the instructors are here in the crowd, so I can point them to you. I believe you all know we have 4 exhibitions. The Kenyan sisters in here. It's really special to have them with us in this moment, bringing this deep history of CPW here to our new space in Kingston. We have a show, Recess by Keisha Scarville, curated by our own Marina Chow. We have the Community Gallery Free for All, Part 1. We had such an amazing, outstanding response that we're going to have a part 2. So if you didn't get enough socializing at our last event, come back. We're going to have another one towards the end of February. With a whole new group, and in the back, of course, Marielle and Mark, which is just an incredible show. So after this is over, you're welcome to go browse a little bit before we shut down for the evening. But without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our director, Brian Wallace, to introduce tonight's esteemed speaker. Thank you.
Hey. So I am Brian Wallace, Executive Director here at CPW. Thank you all for coming out. As Sarah mentioned, this is the first of our Meet the Artists that is going to take place in this place, but come back every Thursday. There'll be something interesting and exciting for you to look at and hear about. Tonight, I'm especially honored to introduce my personal favorite writer, and one that you all know from his many publications and writing in New York Review of Books. Her most recent book, I Heard Her Call My Name, was one of the 10 best books by the New York Times for 2024. You can get a copy here. I strongly recommend, great read. But also Lucy is known as a photo historian. Somewhat lesser known, she taught photo history at Bard College for many years until recent retirement. Known for the books Evidence and this book, Folk Photography, which has just been reissued, won the International Center of Photography Infinity Award in 2009, I believe it was, and an extraordinary critical review of what is now generally called vernacular photography, my favorite subject, postcards and the like. Lucy is a lifelong collector of postcards, so you're going to hear a little bit about that obsession. So please, a warm welcome for Lucy Sante.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for showing up on this frigid night. My goodness. It's the kind of night on which I tend to think I should go to that thing, but nah. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Real Photo Postcard, which is a distinct phenomenon that probably its heyday, well, it starts in 1905. And depending on what you consider a heyday, that lasts until about 1909, or maybe 1912, or maybe until the war breaks out. In any case, it was kind of over by 1920, although in various rural areas, it dribbled on as late as the 1950s. It was the product of at least three phenomena. One was the postcard fad itself, which began probably in France in the 1890s. And of course, as many real photo postcards as there were, the great bulk of postcards were photolitho. That's why these are called real photo, because they're not made on a litho press. They're made in the darkroom. So each of these is an original photograph. Hello? Oh, well, there was a question there. And the other phenomenon was the fact that the USPS reduced the postal rate of sending a postcard to a penny in 1905. Previously, it cost as much as a letter, meaning 2 cents. And the third factor, of course, is the proliferation suddenly of lightweight portable cameras, which made it possible, and they're relatively inexpensive. So it made it possible for photo studios to show up in every backwater in the country. There was no place that did not have a photo studio, and most places would have 2 or 3, and a city as large as Kingston would probably have 10. And most of it was conducted in improvised studios in the back rooms of storefronts, such as this. What wasn't done outside. So it was a product of the small towns of America, because fundamentally, when we talk about postcards, we're talking about two very different phenomena. We know postcards, or at least those of us who are old enough to remember sending postcards, as something that you do as a tourist. You visit Vladivostok, you've got to send postcards to everybody back home. These are the opposite. These were not made for tourists. There was no tourism. These were made for the people who lived there, who had 99% of them arrived from somewhere east or maybe west or over an ocean or two, and made for them to send back home. So they're not for our outsiders. They're from insiders to outsiders. And the thing that I find really compelling about these is how they were sort of reinventing photography on their own. There were no stylistic models for them to draw on. They'd seen chromolithographs and stuff, but that wasn't the same thing as real life. So it's coming out of these small towns, far from the next small town, linked to anywhere by the railroad. Some of these towns were very new. I keep intending to Google that, see if it still exists. But, it doesn't look that different from towns that have been there for 3 years. And of course, towns that have been around long enough to acquire a certain seediness. And towns with big city pretensions, and street lighting is a major part of that. Not every one of these towns has that. And even towns that become actual cities. This is Boise, Idaho during an Elks convention. That elk had like diamonds in its eyes and stuff like that. And they recovered all the minerals. The elk stayed there for 4 days before it was taken down. And these towns were full of businesses that had to be publicized. All kinds of businesses. And even heavy industry of sorts. And of course, there was one means of egress. And sometimes there were disasters, as we shall see. And towns were made up of their people. And people were most of the subjects of these real photo photographers. People would come into the studio and present themselves variously, various degrees of comfort with the whole operation, various degrees of formality, self-presentation. Some people wanted to look sharp. Some people didn't care. It's awfully hard to tell sometimes what is a family snapshot and what is a professional photograph, because anybody could print their pictures on postcard stock provided by Azo or Velox or any of the many companies that made postcard stock. So this might be an intimate family portrait. It certainly looks like it from the baby. It's like the picture was taken by dad, but it's a beautifully composed and lit photograph. So who knows? Maybe it was a photographer visiting, because that happened too. They made house calls, these photographers. And every kind of person wanted their picture taken in all kinds of get-ups. I always look at this one and I remember there's something about the backdrop and the lighting that always makes me think of Irving Penn's series of small trades that he made around 1960. Yeah. Some of them were snapshots. The photographers really didn't know what they were doing. The classic cutting off the top of the head move. This is one of my favorites. And, it took me years to figure out, like, what's going on here? Well, in fact, the guy on the right has borrowed a suit from the photographer, and it's several sizes too large. That's what's going on. This is a common thing. I've seen pictures, not postcards, but I've seen pictures of convicted murderers. Like, 3 men were arrested for robbing a mail train and shooting the conductor. And they're posed for their mugshots in the same suit. And it's literally the same suit. And in fact, I found for years I'd had 3 photo postcards of my grandmother and her 2 sisters taken at a rural studio in Belgium, in the Ardennes. And I thought, wow, isn't that wonderful? They all have this identical dresses. Well, no, that was the dress borrowed from the photographer, because, people didn't have money. They couldn't just order something online. And some people had their own opinions or ambitions or dreams. or dreams? Or dreams? And so the city was made up of a lot of people. And here this is my Kingston subsection here. So these guys, according to the legend written on the back, are the jurors and alternates in the Van Allen murder trial. Unfortunately, I went through the online archive of the Kingston Freeman. I couldn't find anything about the Van Allen murder trial, which must have been significant. And I love there's your streetcar, Kingston, Rosendale, High Falls. These are Kingstonians in 1917 lining up to volunteer to fight in the Great War. And I don't know what's going on in this picture, but they are by Aura Place and the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks, which are now part of the Midtown Linear Park. And the Aura Place sign is behind them. So that means we're looking, Aura Place, by the way, is tiny streets, about half a block long. And we're looking east toward Broadway. And this is Decoration Day, 1907, and that is City Hall. And it's slanted lawn, not yet bestrewn with monuments. And I don't know what holiday this is, but you've got some of your fellow townspeople in Indian drag here. Maybe it's Thanksgiving, and they're walking down Washington Avenue. You can see the sign for Lucas Avenue to the left there. That's Kingston. And, you know, Kingston was probably near the upper limit of how big a town would get and still have photo postcards because, you know, your bigger towns didn't need them. Everything would be on colorful photo lithos printed in Germany until they couldn't because of the war. It was, you know, it was really kind of a mark of relative poverty to, you know, or out of the wayness to have photo postcards representing your town. Kingston was almost too big for that. And so, again, businesses had to be publicized. And the local industries, those are, of course, bales of cotton waiting for the gin. And agriculture. And wage slavery in a ultra-processed foods plant. And business. That's a hotel somewhere. And fantasies. And religion. There's a lot of religion in real photo postcards. River baptisms are a frequent subject, as are these temporary tabernacles that would be put up by visiting evangelists who usually came with their own music. These people toured the Midwest relentlessly for like 20 years. And if anybody has any idea what this represents, I'd be grateful. I've tried to research Hensel's dream. You got me. Anyway, it happened in Buda, Illinois. And then there were hoedowns. This is actually one of the few pictures in here I don't own, but I loved it so much I had to scan it anyway. You know, look at all the parts of this. You've got the band on the dais. You've got the dancers. You've got the caller. You've got the backs. And I don't know what that guy is doing, but it's, you know, all of Saturday night compressed tightly into one frame. And this too, I'm glad to see this picture this big. I always wanted to blow it up because there's so much detail here. So it's Strum, Nebraska. They're trying to get the parade started. Uncle Sam is PO'd. The beauty queen is sitting disconsolately by the bass drum. Look at the float with the glamour girls over on the left. It's just such a portrait. And of course, you'll notice there's no paved roads in any of these pictures, right? This is before highways, not just before the interstate. This is before any kind of highway. Right? It would take you a month across the country. And theatricals. Peru Junior College in Peru, Illinois, I believe. And on the back it says, "No doubt you'll recognize your friend Jumbo." And Oompa bands, which, like every city, every town had one. I mean, not just fly-specs towns, but anything that had like a school would have an Oompa band. And they varied by ethnicity. A lot of them were German, but, go down to New Orleans and they're African. I also liked a little boy there who looks like Buster Brown. This is the heyday of Buster Brown. And hallucinogenic drugs, as one does. Fairs in general. Again, this is a picture that has to be looked at closely because you don't immediately realize that it's the miniature horse tent. And he's represented above with his larger siblings. And there's his miniature horseshoes and miniature halter next to the palm reader's tent, the Ballston Spa Fair in 1912. Shooting galleries. This is a total work of art, this one, right? And sports. There aren't that many sports well, that's not true. There are baseball teams, but plenty. But sports in action. And I've never, ever seen another card like this in this newspaper format. You'd think more people would have done it, but maybe it was hard. In any case, you get a full account of the fight and the picture. And John Nelson left 20,000 photographs or something to the Nebraska State archives or whatever, and a lot of it has been digitized, but there's nothing that looks like this at all. And homespun family entertainment. Love these people. And harvest celebration, ancestral harvest celebration. And along the way, they developed this kind of deadpan, forlorn poetry. I always imagined this as a picture that could have been taken by Buster Keaton's character in The Cameraman. Or this one, as he carefully shoved the title over to the side where it wouldn't interfere with that beautiful expanse of rutted road. But, the guy and the dog, and they're headed off. Or this one, two men embracing, headed away. The prototypical general store at the crossroads. It's a picture like this that really feels like frozen time. You feel like you could walk into the picture. Or this from the impressionist school of real photo postcard photographers. And again, this is a fairly prolific postcard photographer here, William King of Minneapolis. And he was a roving photographer who worked all across the northern plains. But there isn't another picture by him that I've ever seen that is anywhere near this. Because he got there and it was raining and he thought, what the heck, might as well try to turn a buck on this one. The crazy house. And so much of the real photo postcard output reminds you that Walker Evans was a child when these were coming around. And the style engraved itself on his practice. What's really weird is that Evans's postcard collection is entirely contained in a bunch of folders in the or binders in the photo department archives at the Met, and it's got a lot of them, and like 3 of them are real photo. They're almost all photolithos, partly because real photo postcards underwent this eclipse. When I started buying them, they still mostly cost like a quarter at most, dime or nickel. They were not valued as much as, signed, actually autographed, like just bearing the printed signature of an artist. That made them valuable. Or having a Coca-Cola logo somewhere in the picture, that made them valuable. These were not. So they were not available to Evans when he was collecting them, which happened in later life. The other weird thing is that I was taken to meet Helen Levitt sometime in the 90s, and she didn't know anything about me. She didn't know that I'd been researching this book really since 1980 about, and I was really preoccupied with these postcards, and she disappeared into the other room and handed me something which turned out to be Evans's first portfolio of postcards from Fortune, which, a lot of those pictures are similar to these pictures, only they're like more perfected, and of course in color, and they look more like drawings than photographs in many cases. And then there are pictures that we can't explain at all. I bought this card in a used furniture store in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which is to say about 5 to 10 miles from where the scene is. And it was in a box in some kind of kitchen hutch along the wall with there were 10, 15 other pictures in the box, which had nothing to do with this one. But, I immediately, I looked at it and I thought, my first thought was, oh, this is some conceptual art shit from the 70s, right? Because the segmentation, what possessed this person to A, take the picture, B, printed as postcard, on stock? Again, we don't know. Was this an amateur? Was it a professional? No idea, no clue. But there's just something so perfect about it. And yet, beyond, this picture predates Picasso and Braque's investigations of analytical cubism by at least 3 years. We'll never know. This poetry, though, really found its niche, especially in covering disaster. And there were so many disasters, mining disasters, such as this one. These are all the personal effects of the victims. Or floods. there's a whole series of these from the Great Mississippi Flood, not of 1927 that Charlie Patton sings about, but the one of I think 1912. And floods happened everywhere, and floods destroyed towns. This, by the way, is it's a funny thing because I bought them separately. But if you look at the pictures that's on the front cover of the current edition of this book, this is inside the same building. In Black River Falls, which happens to be Black River Falls, Wisconsin, is also the location for Wisconsin Death Trip, the famous book by Michael Lucy, came out in 1973 and has been republished many times since, about this town that seemed to be gripped by some kind of psychic evil, because they he balanced the photographs, which are, glass plate negatives from the archives of the town photographer, with excerpts of news items from the local newspaper. Very, very easy to thumb the scale with something like that, but the pictures are pretty stunning. Anyway, Black River Falls was like half destroyed not so long after those pictures were taken. Car crashes, not a lot of them yet, but they happened. And they were novelty when they did. Tornadoes. Mudslides. Lightning strikes. Train wrecks. I'm only showing you one, but there's like thousands. And of course, fires. That was there's a current version of the Cliff House, which has stood for quite a long time, because this is the fourth, I believe, the fourth Cliff House, and the first four versions all burned down. Avalanches. This is the kind of card that, collectors of these things rate condition very highly. And you can find, some of these cards, fit the description. They look like they just came out of the darkroom, because they've been preserved between the pages of a Bible for 110 years. But I really like pictures with postcards with evidence of use. And this one is looks like it was carried around in a pocket for a really long time. Also, the caption, which may have been written by the photographer Dalgleish, who is actually a well-known photographer of the Rocky Mountains. It's written in pencil. Shit, that's my phone. This is not the first one. I never get phone calls. When I do, I'm usually on stage. Yeah. Sorry about that. Breaking the fourth wall or whatever. So hurricanes, this is Galveston after one of their many hurricanes. And of course, crime, ordinary workaday crime like this, or the larger scale. These are rubberneckers on the farm of Belle Gunness, who was America's first recognized prolific female serial murderer. She lured lonely bachelors to her farm and then dispatched them. And the thing is, she escaped and was never seen again. She might still be lurking around your house. And of course, what happens after crime. And populist riots. This is what happens with a populist riot. So this is Muskegon, Michigan, and they had raised the fares on the streetcars, I think from like 2 cents to 4 cents or something like that. So the population was enraged and destroyed most of the streetcar fleet. So then they had no streetcars. And then this is the first real photo postcard I ever bought. I bought it from a guy who was standing there in front of Cooper Union in Manhattan with 2 little stacks of photo postcards at his feet. And I was just completely taken aback. What the hell? I knew what a photo postcard was because they had a completely different history in Europe. And they, didn't document small towns. They were usually documenting ceremonies or else used for portraits. And some of my baby pictures were printed as photo postcards. So I knew what I was looking at in a general way, but what is this? And I bought the guy's whole inventory for $10. And I knew immediately what in a general sense, what it was, which is that these were effects of the dead. It used to be in the 70s when an old person died, their belongings would just be, if they didn't have, living relatives, the landlord would just pitch their belongings out on the street. And sometimes you'd find amazing things. I once opened a box to see what was in it, and what was in it were first editions of 10 Days That Shook the World and Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist by Alexander Berkman in its Mother Earth Press edition, was published 3 blocks from where I found the box. So these were clearly from a man who, and the age works out, 1980, et cetera, who had been a sailor or soldier, I think it was mostly naval, who participated in the invasion of Veracruz in 1915, I think, under General John J. Pershing, went on to become the great hero of the war in Europe. And I don't know who these people are exactly. Local militia around Veracruz. The picture was taken by Hadsel, forget his first name, this picture and the next, who's an American photographer resident in Veracruz for 20 years, who mostly took, the ordinary subjects, portraits and all that, but then documented this invasion, which was one of the 2 legs of the war between the United States and Mexico that raged from about roughly 1910 to 1920. There was Veracruz on the one side, and on the other was the border war that raged continuously between Texas and Arizona. This is after the American invasion of Veracruz, and as you can see, it was a massacre. The Americans did not meet a lot of resistance, and the Americans were very, very overpowered, multiple warships worth of men. The war was covered on both sides, Mexican as well as American. This is a Mexican card. Evidently, it just blown up a train, which happened a lot. And not just between Americans and Mexicans, but between different factions on the Mexican side. And this picture, which is obviously a Mexican card, that's been bootlegged by an American who wrote a new caption. You can tell it's a bootleg because it's like a shade darker than it should be. The Mexicans also bootlegged American cards too, so they went back and forth. And you know, by the way, the war and the postcard were kind of meant for each other. This was the main way in which the war was documented, was in postcards. And back in the 90s, I had the good fortune to be allowed to spend 3 days in the New York Times morgue, where it was miles and miles of filing cabinets, and inside were photographs just stuffed higgledy-piggledy into these manila folders and filed according to this arcane system that I could not figure out. And when I looked up Mexican War, you know, this war, almost all the contents were postcards that had been sent from the front to the editorial offices. And this card has always gotten me because of its dramatic subject matter and anti-dramatic treatment. You know, is what Roland Barthes would call the punctum. For me, it's these guys' butts. You can tell they're farmers, you know. They're not your like crackerjack firing squad team you've seen in movies, you know, executing Marlene Dietrich in Dishonored. No, they're like putting down a stunned ox, you know, and people are like looking at this over our eyes. The yucca plant in the middle looks about as important as the subject of the firing squad. And after the war, it was a whole new world. You know, it's the small town ideal. I mean, obviously small towns hung on, but the small town ideal, especially, you know, these places that were connected only by the railroad and the mail, that fostered real tight social organization when they functioned, that is. And mind you, a lot of postcards are sent by people looking for work, people drifting through, etc. But nevertheless, at the core, there's visibly the village and its complicated bonds. After the war, things started changing. Radio came in, for one thing. That opened up a lot, you know. And, you know, by and by, more regular mail delivery, newspapers from the big cities, movie houses spreading, movies occurring in sound, the rural electrification program, on and on, served to break up the small town, which is still a kind of vision in political rhetoric today. Instead, what you got was this brave new world. And this is a phenomenon from during the Depression. This is a marathon dance. And Bedford Zoo in Bedford, New Hampshire. If you're old enough, you might remember a movie called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Jane Fonda is about marathon dances. These were dances where they would just dance. They were permitted, you know, 15-minute naps and were spoon-fed as they danced. But basically, the idea is that you dance until you dropped, and the last couple standing would win. You see, poor Joan has already collapsed over here. I mean, this is far from this bucolic ideal, you know. This, even though there's a lot of disaster in the pictures. Even so, there's some kind of hope. There's, you know, our town will be big next year, this kind of stuff. We've turned a corner here. We're already aiming toward decline. And, you know, the nightlife after repeal. it's like, well, it's like you look at film noir, every bar is a dive bar. Well, that was true until the 80s or 90s. Every bar was a dance bar, but these really look like dives, even though they've been lit up to display most advantageously. I don't know what town this is, because everybody would know. Oh yeah, there's Dan's bar. And of course, the rapid availability of everything for sale. And full circle, farm auctions, the death of country life. It's already going on in 1950. But, if you read statistics, I mean, the number of family farms, and the hundreds of thousands of family farms in the 19th century kept being reduced again all through the decades. Whether the prosperity was up or down, family farms continued to decline. So that's it for the pictures, but I did want to talk a little bit about the phenomenon or epiphenomenon. Now, as I say, I began collecting with that one card and, well, the guy's whole inventory. And that was interesting in itself, mind you, because that picture is spectacular. Some of the other pictures are good. Some of them are botches. They're like printed badly or underexposed, overexposed. They're just like what people saved. And people did tend to save these. That's one thing that makes them so valuable because, a motel postcard from the 1950s likely has not got thrown away. But these pictures, everybody recognized their uniqueness and their value. So even if they were kept deep in the attic through most of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, many emerged with the birth of eBay. So I'd been, anytime I I saw an antique store, I'd walk in and there might be a salad bowl full of them, or there might be a heap, or they might have them organized in shoe boxes. And they cost a dime or a quarter. There were a few like hobby journals, there were mail auctions. And then eBay changed everything. eBay got rid of all the antique stores for one thing. But suddenly, there was like page after page of listings. And so I decided when I started, after buying the Mexican War cards, I started buying more, I found more Mexican War cards at a bookstore on Greenwich Avenue, and so an obsession was beginning to form. So I've never been a collector. I don't collect. I accumulate. That's a different story. But collecting has always seemed a little sordid to me. And so I made a pact with myself that I would collect, but I would write a book. And I would stop collecting when I published the book. And the book was published in 2009, and I completely stopped. I no longer collect photographs or postcards or anything of that description unless a really amazing one turns up under my nose, but I'm human. Anyway, it's still a marvel to me because it's a territory that is incredibly vast. We don't know how many of these things were made, how many survive. We have no idea at all. So that means that there are you can't really make a map for the viewer, the reader, the consumer. There are no peaks. There are some famous cards, and here's an interesting thing. There are some famous cards. There's a guy who went over Niagara Falls in a barrel. There's some Theodore Roosevelt speaking off the back of a train. There's the Jeffries Johnson fight in Goldfields, Nevada. And these are famous in part because they're common. They're historic, but they were produced in large numbers. By contrast, the obscure cards, the cards that you look through the 25-cent box and reject, they're rare. There might only be one of those in the whole wide world. So you've got this inverted economy, and you've got an unmappable reach. And so that means that really, I mean, it's photo postcards can only, well, much like snapshots, although, you know, it is a much more concentrated thing. You can't establish a criterion, really. All you can do is have collectors publish collections of their favorites. And we have a whole bunch of those. Most recently, Cosmetics Heir Leonard Lauder's collection, which came out about 2 years ago. And that's really exemplary. It's like the best one, I think, that I've seen, because it's done with like a German positivist document. You know, it's like Karl Blossfeld or August Sander's Family of Man. Things are broken down by categories. So you have milk trucks, and then, you know, milk deliveries, and then, you know, et cetera. I mean, or then bread deliveries, and then, you know, combine harvesters, and it gives you the range that way. But it doesn't account for the weirdos. You know, that's the thing. Most of these books, and by now I must have maybe over a dozen, a score maybe, of these photo postcard books. And there are a few that are on specific photographers or specific locales. But the others are just completely like, these are postcards I dig. When I started on my project, what I was going to do was to write a complete, like, big book on the subject, where I was going to establish first, you know, for all time what the, you know, impossible. But then I was also beaten to it by a gentleman named Robert Bogdan, who published his Real Photo Postcard Guide, which is quite the way I would have done it, but it, you know, biographies of noted photographers and, you know, that kind of thing, and information about card stock and postal rates and everything you want to know there. So my book is, you know, oh, and I was collecting pictures I like, but also with a view to representing the whole phenomenon. You know, I mean, if I hadn't had enough, if the collection didn't have enough farm animals in it, I'd quickly rush to supply more, you know. So my book is completely subjective, because I know now it's not ever intending to be complete, but still trying to render an account of the phenomenon. I guess that's all I've got to say, but I will happily take questions. And way in the back. Not really.
All right, thank you. That was great. I collect a lot of real photo postcards on eBay. I'm one of those people. And I feel like I finally got a handle on what is, in fact, an RPC and not what is just a postcard. But what I still don't really understand is who is making them, who is buying them, and what, maybe a related question, are they multiples? Because some of them seem like they could just be a family photo or something that somebody has mocked up themselves, and then some of them I'll have like a preacher who's clearly well known, and it looks, even though it seems to be a genuine RPC, it still looks like it was, if not mass produced, there more been printed. Is there a question in there somewhere?
Yeah, sure. And it's something I forgot to address before. Who made them? Often it was, in a bigger town, there would be a standalone photographer or more than one. And some of these people had been in business since the carte de visite days, since maybe as far back as the 1870s, maybe. Others were people there were plenty of photo magazines being published there. And there were classified ads in the back where people were selling their photo practice in some small town, So if you could raise the scratch, you'd have it all there. The lights, the camera, you could just buy the whole thing. And really, you could just get a Kodak 3A, a tripod, and a few lights, and you were in business. So if the town was too small to sustain a full-time photographer, it would be the druggist often, or a newsstand operator, the bookstore manager, people like that would double as photographers. And who bought them? Everybody. Many of these were sent to relatives, generally back east, or like that train wreck picture was sent to Germany, to Schleswig-Holstein. And a lot of them were unsent. They were just kept in a mirror frame or, between the pages of the family Bible. And that's one thing about eBay, is that all this stuff came down from the rafters. As soon as there was interest, I used to go to postcard shows in New York City. And I remember in the early 80s, it was the usual jack-o'-lantern, Coca-Cola, Keen Cutter, all these things, Buster Brown, people collected stuff like that. And then it'd be like one box of real photo. But eBay just, suddenly people rediscovered grandma stuff in the trunk in the attic, and they big time appeared. I think it was, multiples, right. Yeah, many of them were multiples. So if they were made by the druggist or the town photographer, they might print 20, 50, 100, who knows, depending on the size of the place. And then they would sell for 2 cents usually, until I have a real photo advertising card that says 5 cents, but I think we're already in the 1920s by then. And then, but as I say, if it's a good enough picture, the family photos are indistinguishable from the commercial product, except in subject, generally. But, there are a lot of botches out there. And that's interesting in itself. There were such an object of value that people would keep even bad photographs. Yes.
Lucy, do you think, what's your opinion, with the perfection of the gelatin print and drugstore people, newspaper, bookstore people could start making photo postcards of events? Did you see that as the start of people beginning slowly, not to letter write anymore, not to tell people stories about what happened, but there was a desire, if you didn't have a photograph, it didn't happen?
There was probably something to that, yeah. What's interesting is that I've looked at, maybe hundreds of thousands of these things, and I've very, very seldom seen a card depicting a dramatic event that had a message on the back describing that event. Usually it's like some raging fire or something like that, some scene of catastrophe. And on the back it says, "Getting along all right, taking my meals at the corner, say hi to Pop." And that's it. These were not enhancements of narrative. Yes.
I used to belong to the postcard club. I have no idea why, but it was on 8th Street, and did you ever go to Gertrude Briggs?
To what?
Gertrude Briggs on 7th Street.
Oh, Gertrude, yeah.
Yeah, she was wonderful. And then Gino.
The last holdout of the Fourth Avenue booksellers.
Gino, random memorabilia. It
Yeah.
seems like they're done for insurance purposes. I mean, I don't know anything about the insurance business, but, you know, it seems like.
Wait, what about insurance
It
purposes?
seems like some of them were made for insurance purposes. Or,
I don't think so. I don't think so. Things were just too primitive for that. I mean, you don't see real estate assessment pictures come into the picture. Well, you do in big cities, but in small towns, I doubt it. It was more like, please take a picture of our house so we can send it to our envious cousins back east. That's really what they're about.
and also removal, you know, such a great business.
The what?
I wound up in Yonkers. and I
Cleaning out people's houses.
Yeah, it's like fascinating. Yeah, fascinating.
Mhm.
It's just like, you know, the stuff that they throw out.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Amazing.
Yeah. And, the United States has gone through periods of deciding the past is over, we must get rid of it.
Yeah.
Happened in the 50s, happened in the 60s, et cetera. Yeah. Oh, hi.
I'm so curious about the messages on the back, the stamps, the addresses, and kind of your perspective as a collector. Because in here, I feel like we're really, prioritizing obviously the front and the picture.
Mhm.
But then the story you just told about what was written on the back of like this, catastrophic fire, say, how much do you balance what's on the back, whether it was sent or unsent, the
Mhm.
address, the stamp, like how much does that like figure into your interest in the postcard?
Well, generally, I'm most interested in the front, and I'm grateful when there's anything of value on the back. In the book, I reprint anything that's of the slightest interest that's on the back. Frequently, it's illegible. It's or just kind of beyond interest. Just strictly chit chat. That's really most of it. There's very little of real documentary value in the writing on the back. I think more so with these cards than with other kinds of postcards, really, depending on, it has a lot to do with place. I mean, postcards being sent to the United States in 1914 from Japan will have a narrative on the back because, gee, we're seeing all these things. But again, these aren't made for tourists. These are made for locals. And the locals, just like they have arthritis, they have indigestion, the weather's turning bad, they're not going to write a whole essay. Everybody knows the bank burned down 4 months ago. So, I just happened to have a picture of it because I bought it along with the newspaper when I didn't have change. Whatever. They're treated very casually.
But Lucy, also, if they know they're going to mail it, and they know everybody in town, the post office is going to read it, doesn't that sometimes mitigate what they say? Because postcards, people are going to read your postcards. Right?
Yeah, well, I guess it probably depends very much on the town, the postmistress, and the railway agent, I mean, I'm sure, things have gotten passed around and reputations destroyed. Probably didn't happen all that often. Yes.
Speaking of that, I have a few old postcards. And I've noticed in a few of them that they're addressed to Alice Roosevelt. And I was wondering if people use like an alias maybe to kind of disguise who they were going to. And I was wondering if you ever heard of that or.
Alec Rosendale.
Yeah.
You found a whole bunch of cards all addressed to Alec Rosendale.
No. I got them in different spots. And I thought it was odd. Like one went to Newark and one went to like up to Saratoga. And I just thought maybe they're using aliases or I don't know if that was.
Hey, you got me, pal. I wasn't there, I swear. Yes. Yeah, if you could come up, please. I'm hard of hearing. That are what? Oh, well, they exist, you know, and they're lynching cards too. I didn't want any part of those, but I didn't have to wonder because they're so unbelievably expensive. I could have gone near them anyway. You know, there's an incredible book called Without Sanctuary, which, you know, is the kind of book you want to like look at through your fingers. And many of the pictures in there are photo postcards.
It's scary, that book, because when they had a lynching, and I had one once, and it was stolen from me in graduate school, but people would actually pose
Oh, yeah.
with the hung person for the photographer.
There were
And
trophy
that was
shots. Yeah.
creepy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's in the book.
Yep. Yes.
Following up on this question about the backside, maybe this is just too esoteric, but I'm thinking about Facebook. People share things in order to say, I'm sharing some things that communicate something about me. So I reshare something to say I care about social values or et cetera. And I'm wondering about the choices people make if they have multiple postcards to share about their town. Do I share about tragedy? Do I share about the economy? Do I advance an idea of social cohesion? I just wondered if you, like, as you think about that, they didn't say anything on the back, but they were communicating something about their worldview beyond just this is my town, particularly if they had multiple choices.
I wouldn't lean on that one too hard because people 110 years ago did not have the same kind of sense of self that we do. They're mostly, you know, they're part of a social fabric. We've developed our hypertrophy senses of self in part because there are so many of us that we don't know how to distinguish ourselves. I mean, just in my own life, you know, if when I was 20, I knew one red-haired urchin who played the flute, today's kid will know 15 red-haired urchins who play the flute. So you have to give them names and backstories and dramas, etc. But in those days, it was just like you were writing to your cousin Myrtle anyway. Why do you need to represent your innermost sense to your cousin Myrtle, who you've known since you were 3? You know, it just wasn't like that. And people chose the picture. You get the sense very often, kind of at random. It's like I need to write to Myrtle. I go down to the drugstore and I pick the first card off the rack. You really get that impression again and again and again. You know, sometimes they'll say, "This is our brand new courthouse." You know, this does happen, but not that often. And the personal information is always, and I mean always, as skimpy and telegraphic as you can imagine. Yes.
This may be a broader question about how people chose to be photographed or how they appear in this period. But I noticed in some of the portraits of people or just postcards you've shown, there was a kind of serious expression or, you know, maybe a little bit of fear facing the photographer, I don't know. But my experience in looking at archives is that at a certain point when things became snapshots and candids and more people had photographs, then you had this growth of expression and big smiles and, you know, carrying on, and everybody knew how to pose. They'd experienced it, you know, on TV maybe. But is there a point in am I right that somewhere in this period, it was really unusual for someone to really appear relaxed in front of the picture?
Yeah. I mean, people were no longer unfamiliar with being photographed, right? Photography at this point had been going for a good 75 years. So it wasn't like frightening the horses anymore. But it was expected that if you were being photographed, it was a serious occasion, and therefore you had to adopt a serious demeanor. You had to be grave and dignified. Those were the social models that everybody knew, and even the people way out on the frontier. They had grown up with these images of authority, and that's what they were striving toward. And people did not really learn to smile for the camera until they saw Hollywood stars do it, until large numbers of people started subscribing to Photoplay magazine, for example. So it doesn't really start showing up until basically the 30s. Everybody is stunned by that. That's a question I get every time. And it's because we're so used to enforced smiling that we're shocked when they don't, right? Anyway. Right.
I was curious how this passion for these documentary real photo postcards fits into your larger vision of the history of photography. You mentioned Walker Evans, and his approach, very unique approach to sort of lyric documentary. And you mentioned several times that you enjoyed the poetry of these images. How do you see that in the larger approach to photography itself?
Well, it's something I've thought about a lot, that these pictures, if they reflect any photographic influence at this point, it might be the Civil War photographs of Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan and people like that, George Barnard, because of the plain four-square style that they have in common, which seems there's something linking those that's not, I can't do any scientific linkages, but there is this, what looks like an American style to me that's distinct from vernacular styles in Europe, for example. These pictures, well, this is 1950, but the earlier ones, think of the fact that they were being made around the same time that Paul Strand was contributing to camera work, such photographs as Truckman's Yard, which shows like a billboard, and a back alley, and how this was a shock to the followers of pictorialist photography. You weren't supposed to see that stuff, the billboards, it's like ugly commercialism. And then, and on the art front, like Ralph Steiner started, making photograph after photograph of billboards and, signs on the sides of buildings and things. But these guys were doing it regularly without thinking twice about it. They had no idea of the aesthetic strictures of the big city. It was a completely populist movement. It existed for a blip, really. I mean, it was just a phenomenon that came and went. But I think you can see the influence reflected in Evans and maybe in other of the FSA photographers too, Dorothea Lange. I mean, there's, again, this, they look more, these pictures seem to me to have more in common with the FSA photographers than with anything published by Alfred Stieglitz. Let's put it that way. So they were, a folk form that actually exerted a great deal of first or second degree influence on art photography afterward. Yes.
Can you just briefly articulate the difference between vernacular and European photography?
I'm having a bit of a hard time. Sorry, I'm old.
The difference
I
between
didn't-
European vernacular and,
Between European vernacular?
I believe that's.
You mentioned how the style
Yeah,
is different.
European vernacular and this. Okay, I don't have any great theory about this. This is just spitballing. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time, especially in the 1990s, going through massive amounts of photo postcards here and in Europe. And the American style is just more uncluttered because the American style is perfectly content to reproduce a house that looks like that against a blank sky. The European always has to cant it, has to put a tree in front of it, has to have a reflection in water over here. Even like, you know, simple village photographers will have some kind of schooling in the principles of art. You know, they've seen it in church, if nowhere else. Americans didn't have that. Americans only know, like, Americans are like children, you know. Sorry, guys. Don't report me to ICE. But it also means they're frank. And, you know, and the funny thing is that I can almost make a distinction between different states. The postcards from New England are not very interesting. Again, because they tend to be steeped in the language of aesthetics. You know, they're going for effects, and it's not interesting. On the other hand, Texas and Oklahoma produce some great photographs because there you really feel like they just invented a camera and figured out how to use it that day. You know, it's everything is broadside of the barn. It's just head on, and interesting collisions of things happen that way. And they're not fully in control of the picture plane, and accidents are allowed to intrude. You know, you look at photo art magazines from the beginning of the 20th century, and the pictures are suffocating. They're all white churches with clouds above them. Nothing. I mean, if you see a white church in these pictures, I mean, there are plenty, but you know, the ones that tend to be in my collection are the ones that are struck by lightning or something like that. You know, it just seems more human to me. Another thing I noticed, by the way, from a lot of hard looking and quick looking at these things, is that I'd seen every human activity recorded in real photo postcards except childbirth. And also one time I had taught a class. I had rotating subjects at Bard, and one of my rotating subjects was just vernacular photography. And at the end, I gave them a take-home exam at the end, and I said, what do you think is missing? Like, what photographic subject or subjects has not been represented in what I've shown you this semester? And like, a lot of people didn't know, but of the answers I got, like 80% of them were food. There was a real squeamishness about showing food. Now you notice that I didn't exclude sex from my inventory of what I didn't see, because there were pornographic real photo postcards. You know, after all, you could print them at home. They didn't have to go to the drugstore to be printed. So you had sex, but weirdly, and this is generally true of European and American photography from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries, you really do not see food. I mean, you might see a row of pumpkins or whatever those are on the table. You might see, you know, preparations for the harvest feast, and, you know, they're like bringing covered dishes or something, but you don't see the contents. You know, there's a whole series of pictures from California of things like railroad trains made entirely of oranges. You know, that is the closest you get to food. You might see people at the dinner table, but their plates have nothing on them. You know, I think there's an idea here that food, it's almost like in that Buñuel movie, food is something private. Food is something you don't show, or you especially do not show the consumption of food. That is an animal activity that we don't want to be associated with. Yes.
I have a request.
Uh-huh.
It's supposed to be a question.
No songs, please. I'm not sure.
I'm not a photographer, I'm a designer, but I kept wanting to like redistribute the archives and look at the typography of all of these
Oh,
things.
yeah.
And some are obvious, emblematic of the time, but some are super inventive use of space.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one that kind of blew my mind. I'm trying to find it in the book. And I think it's a bakery.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, is there a way?
Oh, yeah, that's
Can you go back?
Buffalo, Oklahoma. Yeah, I can go back. Hang on.
He knows, Buffalo, Oklahoma.
Yeah, I was just trying, I don't know how fast you can get it. I was just, and it was called City.
Baker, yeah.
But that was the city.
I saw it.
Okay.
I know towards the beginning.
Yeah,
I
there's.
just, like, the sign was super long, the letter forms are so beautiful. It just kind of blew my mind. It's like, I need to see it again. But it's beautiful seeing these letter forms. Especially that they're hand painted, and it seems aligned with this kind of.
Getting a review of the
Yeah.
This is fun.
There
Here
it
it is.
Isn't that a crazy sign?
Yeah.
It's like made of 4 parts with 2 type sizes, and it's in a city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the period. Oh, well, you noticed that posters, newspaper headlines, everything had a period. Yeah, until sometime later in the 20th century. And sign painter was like the photographer. A part of every small town there would be a sign painter. Reverse lettering in gold for your bank window, et cetera.
That use of space, there's a period.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what's that shape?
Wasn't it the
It's
time,
weird.
wasn't it the time that removed the period after Mr. and Mrs. and saved an astronomical number of tons of ink?
In England, you mean?
No,
Here?
New York Times.
Do they? I don't think they do that.
Well, maybe it was England.
Yes, sir.
I'm just curious about when people wrote on the card.
Uh-huh.
I mean, obviously there were no markers back then. It looks like marker was painted.
It's paint or white ink, and they're all written backwards, because they're all written on the plate. So that's why they so often look really awkward and have letters flipped and stuff like that.
Back side to the sign, or is that on the next building? It looks like there's a bigger sign on the other side of that sign.
That could be. I think you might have to go to Buffalo to find out. All right. Well, thank you so much. You've been great.